So I want to welcome everybody here to our presentation. This is going to be an interesting one. I'm very excited about it. So to kick us off, I'm Victoria Jones. I'm the Chief Global Affairs Officer at the University of California, Irvine. And we're so privileged to have, as UC Irvine, very strong relationships with Korean universities, the Korean government, the Korean community in Los Angeles and Orange County. And some of the things that we've been working on, I was just thinking about this, the very first international trip that Chancellor Gilman wanted to take when he was a brand new chancellor at the University of California, he insisted that his first trip be to Korea. And so we went to South Korea and we met with government officials and we met with university presidents, and we have continued to build those relationships in a very strong and tight way. And a few of the activities, we have a Center for Critical Korean Studies that was part of an outgrowth of those visits from Chancellor Gilman year on year, funded by the Korean government. And Joseph Jeon is going to be presenting and coordinating our event today. And he's the director of that center. And it gives me a great feeling to know how far we've come and the relationships we're building. We also have a Korean Law Center at UC Irvine. We have a Korea Corner in our library. The School of Medicine has an annual exchange of research with the Korea University. Seoul National University has been exchanging students with us for years. Yonsei University is a place where our students go. And so it's just so wonderful that we have experts and good relationships that are allowing us to now do an event to dig down and explore some of the really tough issues that are happening between North and South Korea. And as we've seen in the last little bit of time, and Dr. Jeon will be giving us a little bit of a history, but it came to the forefront under the Trump administration, and there seemed to be some movement, and then there's been a retraction. And so really wanting to understand and put this into context. And so we've invited specialists from Korea to join us to discuss this, and Dr. Jeon is going to moderate. There will be time for questions at the end. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom call, and those questions will be answered at the end, as many as we can get to. And if we don't get to yours, I want to apologize in advance. We'll do what we can to answer as many questions as possible. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Joseph Jeon.
Thank you so much, Victoria. As Victoria mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Critical Korean Studies here at UCI. And you know, the CCKS is delighted to be partnering with the Office of Global Engagement to present this event. I was asked just to offer a brief historical sketch as background for today's event. Many of you, I am sure, are familiar with this history, and indeed, it's likely that some of you even lived through it. So please bear with me if this is a review for some of you. The 38th parallel of the Korean Peninsula remains today is arguably the most enduring legacy of the global Cold War, and certainly the most visible example in contemporary global geopolitics. Long after the fall of the Berlin Wall nearly 3 decades ago, the Korean demilitarized zone is still one of the tensest and most contested borders in the world. We were given a brutal reminder just last week of how severe the situation is when a North Korean patrol allegedly killed a South Korean man who had been watching for illegal fishing in waters near the northern limit line, that is the extension of the border between North and South Korea into the Yellow Sea. As tragic as the events may have been, this was just the most recent example of a series of conflicts, crises, and incidents that have persisted since the armistice, the 1953 armistice agreement that ended fighting, what is officially called a, quote, cessation of hostilities, which had begun in 1950. The Korean War was a brutal war. It claimed 3 million in casualties. It also divided families, many of whom have remained separated on opposite sides of a heavily policed border. Just as a personal note, I have a colleague here at UCI, Sylvia Nam, who had the opportunity to travel a few years ago to North Korea to find a long-lost grandfather. When she arrived, she learned that her grandfather had already passed away, but that he left behind an entire family, which he began when he was separated from his original family after the war, and Sylvia knew nothing about the existence of this whole other family. Incidentally, we had hoped to have an event centered around Sylvia's experiences that we had to cancel because of the pandemic, but we'll hopefully be presenting it soon. In recent years, there's been, of course, an effort to formally end the Korean War with the proposed peace treaty on Korean Peninsula. But despite the Panmunjom Declaration, which was intended to pave the way for a more permanent peace agreement, this has not yet happened. And this leads us to the title of our event today, The Tension That Never Goes Away, North Korea-South Korea Relations. Now, normally as a moderator, I would try to play my cards close to the vest and keep my questions to myself to make them more dramatic as I ask them. But today, because of the extreme complexity and the nuance of the situation between North and South Korea, I want to keep things very simple. And I want to let you all know from the very beginning that we have exactly 3 questions for our panelists today, and I'll tell you up front what they are. The first of all is, what is going on the Korean Peninsula? The second question is, why is this happening? And the third question is, what is the path forward? My hope is that if we can answer these 3 deceptively simple questions, we will move a long way into understanding what is a very, very complex and delicate situation. To help us with these questions, we have 2 very esteemed colleagues from Korea who are speaking to us from Korea, and this makes me both delighted and sad because, you know, I couldn't personally travel to Korea this summer. My family goes every summer, so it's great to see glimpses of the place that I miss very much. Our first speaker today, our first panelist is Min-kyo Koo. He's a professor of the Graduate School of Public Administration at Seoul National University and head of the Peace Cooperation Office, Institute for Peace and Unification Studies. Professor Koo has expertise in non-traditional security issues and relations with neighboring countries. He can address trade, finance, and security relations between North and South Korea and with other countries. Our second esteemed panelist is Bong-geun, professor at the Department of Security and Unification Studies at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security in the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Jeon has academic expertise and government experience in the area of relations with North Korea, nuclear non-proliferation, and unification efforts. So without further ado, I am going to ask both the panelists the first question. And that first question is, again, what is going on the Korean Peninsula? And Dr. Koo, if you could start us out, please.
Dr. Jeon and Dr. Jones, thanks a lot for a very nice introduction and organizing this very timely and relevant webinar. By the way, happy Korean Thanksgiving. Actually, we celebrated our Thanksgiving yesterday, and it's yours today in the US. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to meet with UCI faculty members, students, and other guests in Southern California and beyond. I have prepared some slides to facilitate my discussion. So regarding the first question, just, you know, this past week, we had 2 painful but very clear illustrations of what is going on in the Korean Peninsula. First, as you may know, last week we had this, tragic and brutal killing of the South Korean civilian in the North Korean waters, right off the NLL, Northern Limit Line. In a couple of days after the incident, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un expressed his apology for this unfortunate killing, and the South Korean government must be very excited about this. But many South Koreans remain shocked and outraged. And many South Koreans are not happy with the way in which the Moon Jae-in government is dealing with this issue. Many South Korean people think that South Korean reaction and responses to this event is rather slow and ambivalent. And second, It was such an ironic contrast that our president delivered a pre-recorded speech to the UN General Assembly last Wednesday. And he called for the ending of the Korean War as the beginning of the peace process in the Korean Peninsula. But it just came out as such a very dramatic moment. And I think these two otherwise unrelated issues demonstrate the tension and the dilemma that both Koreans face in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
And Dr. Jeon, would you care to answer the first question?
Yes. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm also very glad to join this UCI event today. I'm just to introduce you, the kind of a context that where we are in. Let me just begin with this political landscape on the Korean Peninsula in East Asia. One of the questions that I used to have for a long time was why Korea was suffering from war, division, nowadays nuclear threats. Nowadays not many countries are suffering from those disastrous events, but somehow Korea is we try to overcome those difficulties, but we are under the very heavy burden of history and in the geopolitical competition in the region. Nowadays, this return of greater power politics in East Asia and the return of geopolitics is again on our shoulders. So it's going to be affect negatively again in our this division, confrontation, and nuclear problems on the peninsula. I think it's going to may continue. But on the other hand, if I look at the DPRK, it's next slide. This is one of the American scholar and the former national security advisor showed this diagram that how the world is divided in this way. There is a big macro confrontation between land power and sea powers. Somehow this titanic confrontation is cut across in Korean Peninsula. That's why we are having this big our homework of overcoming this kind of confrontation that have been there for over centuries and still there. And next, my slide is showing that this DPRK is somehow mysterious to us, though we are the same Korean people, the same languages, sharing the same culture. I believe they have the same Thanksgiving day today, just like us. But they are under the serious burden of sanctions, and coronavirus was hitting DPRK. I think so. And also they had a very serious typhoon damage this year. But somehow DPRK is surviving. And especially during the last couple of years, DPRK was making some economic progress. Someone who are taking photo of this photo in the near Daedong River was calling it a Pyongyang. It's like a Pyongyang Manhattan. But on the other hand, as the other slide shows, DPRK has another face. This is, when we took a satellite photo of DPRK at the night, DPRK it's almost completely dark. It's like a sea. Right? Can I see just a blue dot, light dots near Pyongyang only. Otherwise, it's very dark. And but still, DPRK is changing. It used to be 100% rely on governmental ration, but now they are building some this market and the black markets, the farmers markets. That's why nowadays people are thinking that since DPRK is probably under some damage of a very serious this typhoon and the coronavirus and sanctions. So someone even called it a perfect storm is hitting DPRK. But somehow DPRK is still surviving, a very mysterious country. As this next slide shows, probably DPRK is the only country in the world who has still sustained their former communist and one-man ruling and the state planning economy, despite the while whole other former communist states somehow changed and transformed. And this is the kind of situation where we are. We have to have, we have this serious homework of how to move in DPRK toward like any other former communist countries, so that it could transform itself and it could be flexible in its own foreign policy, and there could be denuclearization. Otherwise, as long as the DPRK is staying in this current situation of self-isolation, and probably may have this sustained tensions between two Koreas in East Asia. Probably that's where we are.
Thank you. So it's interesting that there's 2 points of emphasis in your answer. One is kind of the South Korean reaction, and the other was more kind of about the political and economic situation in North Korea. This leads us to the second question, which is, why is this happening? And I'll leave to you what this actually is, because I think that's part of an open question here. That is, what is happening and why is it happening? So Professor Gu, if you could begin us here as well.
Thank you. As Professor Jeon mentioned earlier, the inter-Korea relations involves national, inter-Korean, regional, and global dimensions. So it's very complicated. But I'd like to just focus on the inter-Korean relations, and then probably expand this a little bit further later. Basically, I'd like to just approach this dilemma from a theoretical perspective. The two Koreas remain oceans apart, as indicated my slide, and I think they are in the same bed with different dreams at best. Let me explain why. Many of you in this room must have encountered each car before. This is one of my favorite pieces, the 20 years crisis. Let me just share with you the key summaries. So he highlights the importance of striking a right balance between utopia and reality. As you can tell, I think this balance is completely broken in the Korean Peninsula. The complete realist, according to Carr, unconditionally accepting the causal sequence of events, deprives himself of the possibility of changing reality. In contrast, the complete utopian, by rejecting the causal sequence, deprives himself of the possibility of understanding either the reality which he is seeking to change or the processes by which it can be changed. This is the nice recap of what is going on in the Korean Peninsula. So one of his conclusions is that the characteristic vice of the utopian is naivety. The characteristic vice of the realist is sterility. So having said that, the next slide, please. This is how I look at the situation in the Korean Peninsula. So I can have this triangle. So in the IR classroom, we learn about realists and institutionalists and the constructivist approach to international relations. Of course, in the classroom, we learned that they hate each other. The realists don't like institutionalists, and the institutionalists do not trust constructivists, and the other way around. But in reality, I think there's a very subtle balance or inseparable and symbiotic relationship among the three different, otherwise different theoretical approaches. So if there's any balance established, we can have this, nice equilateral triangle. At one corner, we have a liberal institutionalism. At the other corner, we have a defensive or offensive realism, and finally, utopian constructivism. But unfortunately, neither North Korea nor South Korea has any balance in these three theoretical perspectives. Let me just take a look at North Korea first. As you can imagine, North Korea has too much realism and too little institutionalism and constructivism. So hopefully the audience can understand this, the graph. As you can see, the DPRK triangle is a little unbalanced, and it has excessive length toward realist approach, whereas short and very limited dimension in terms of institutionalism and constructivism. You must know why. And North Korea's behaviors can be illustrated by its building up a nuclear arsenal, missile capabilities, and forward deployment near the DMZ area of conventional weapons, and very harsh and brutal responses to particularly South Korea. By the way, North Korea can be characterized as being both defensive and offensive realist. North Korea is very offensive towards South Korea. It has not abandoned its ultimate goal to unify Korea in its own term. To that extent, I think North Korea is offensive realist. But when it comes to its own security, particularly vis-a-vis the United States and the Western world, North Korea is a defensive realist. So its ultimate goal is to secure its security, national security, rather than expansion of power. So I think that's the dilemma that North Korean realism has right now. In contrast, South Korea, ROK, has too much of constructivist elements in its approach to North Korea, particularly the incumbent Moon Jae-in government has pushed us toward this direction too much, I believe, while it has just too little elements of realism and institutionalism. The very best example of this approach is the last week's President Moon Jae-in's UN General Assembly speech. As you can see on the right-hand side, he urged the end of the Korean War. But just as I said earlier, it just came out at a very awkward and irrelevant moment. Plus, the South Korean government has been hesitating to conduct the joint military exercise with the United States, etc. And very best, it can be characterized as the so-called moonlight policy, as opposed to or in relation to the sunshine policy of the former President Kim Dae-jung. And I think South Korean approach is okay. I mean, you need everything, realist, liberal, institutionalist, and constructivist elements to have a nice triangle, but it is not balanced. That's my first concern. And secondly, why is it problematic? I think it's very geocentric. The Moon Jae-in government thinks that it's at the center of the universe. So it can persuade, it believes that the South Korean government can persuade or convince not only North Korea, but also other neighboring countries, including China, the US, and Japan, toward the peaceful coexistence in the Korean Peninsula. But I need I think both South Korea and North Korea need to establish the right balance to have any reasonable and productive discussion between the two countries. Let me just remind you of what the former commander of the U.S. forces in South Korea, General Bowell Bell, said. He just highlighted, until we have a peaceful coexistence, we need a deterrence against North Korea. Between South Korea and the U.S., the key alliance is important. So I believe South Korea can do that on its own, reduce the little bit of constructivist element in its policy while expanding and strengthening its realist and institutional approach. Of course, North Korea needs some external help because I don't believe it can do that on its own. So in the end, we can put the Korean Peninsula in this very nice equilateral triangle, I hope. By the way, let me just remind you of South Korea's approach to institutionalist approach. Generally speaking, South Korea is very strong and good at the rules-based order in international relations. South Korea has produced the former general, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban-ki-moon. South Korea has the president of ITLOS, International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, Judge Baek Jin-hyun. We also have the Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, and we are one of the South Koreans are running for the presidency of the World Trade Organization. So that indicates that the South Korea has proved its ability and capability to work on international orders. But for some reason, maybe for obvious reason, South Korea becomes very passive and inactive when it comes to dealing with North Korea from an international law perspective. So I think we need to change that. Thank you very much.
And Professor Koo, before we move on, could I just ask for a little clarification about your terms? I think our audience would appreciate. Just thinking about the difference between realism on the North Korean side and then utopianism on the South Korean side. Do you mean by realism a certain kind of preoccupation with material circumstances, that sort of thing, and utopianism as an over-commitment to ideals? And is that kind of what you mean by that difference?
Yes, you are very correct. So okay. I believe the reason why North Korea is very much obsessed with nuclear weapons clearly indicates its very materialistic and realistic approach to its own security.
So practical concerns.
Yes, okay. South Korea, well, as you can see in the latest incident, South Korea, I mean, especially the Moon Jae-in government wants to see the relationship between the two Koreas as a brotherhood and sisterhood. It's too much of, utopian and ideational elements dominating the inter-Korea relations from my perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Jeon?
Yes. Let me just turn to one previous slide showing, this how, these countries are moving around. I certainly agree most of parts of what the Professor Koo said, but I have a slightly different interpretation of what's going on in the peninsula. In fact, the DPRK is very much realistic, materialistic, and practical country. But on the other hand, it's somehow very utopian, very idealistic. If we saw just the materialistic conditions of DPRK, it should have been collapsed several times already. But somehow it's surviving. It has extraordinary resistance and resilience. It's not coming from their materialistic conditions. So it's somehow very unusual. That's why we couldn't solve this DPRK problem. As Professor Gu said, we have very idealistic and post-Cold War mentality that, okay, DPRK is such a materialistically such a bad situation. So it's going to collapse, or it had to be changed somehow. So we have spent almost decades until DPRK changed, transformed, or collapsed. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. That's why I believe one of the big reasons we couldn't solve the DPRK nuclear problem. If only we have a more realistic approach, or more of a, then we could have engaged with the DPRK. Somehow reflecting on what had happened during the last couple of decades, we missed, I think, a real opportunity. During the post-Cold War era, we are such superior conditions. And the US, this is a US-led post-Cold War order area. And US was a hegemonic state in the world. But somehow during those years, we failed to utilize our advantage, US advantage, in persuading, pressuring DPRK to give up the weapons and the weapons program. Somehow it didn't work out. So as I show in these slides, somehow it was DPRK's tenacity, its own very pursuit of nuclear weapons program, and then we couldn't somehow press or persuade them. That's why there was a very much a cyclical pattern of the nuclear crisis was repeating. There was a nuclear crisis, nuclear agreement was collapsing. There was already, you may remember there is already numerous DPRK nuclear crisis and the nuclear agreements. All of them are gone. Even now we have this, Trump, Kim Jong-un summit. There was a Singapore agreement, but Hanoi, it was not working very often. Somehow, if you really want to succeed in denuclearization negotiation, we have to learn to stop these cyclical patterns. And somehow, even at this moment, DPRK nuclear capability is increasing. And in my own calculations, its nuclear capability tends to be double every 8 years. So I believe that if only we have a very much, in that sense, I very much agree with Dr. Good that we have to be more realistic. DPRK is not going to give up their weapons easily. Then our preparation, our policy should be somehow more engaging, and we need to engage with more incentives, and we need to engage with a much stronger pressure so that DPRK should make a very difficult choice. Until now, since we are just in a waiting mode, DPRK transformed the collapses. DPRK did have such a serious dilemma situation. They just endure the weather and just keep on developing their weapons. That's what had happened. I think now it's time to change that.
Okay, thank you. And our third and final question is, what is the path forward? And back to you, Dr. Gu.
Okay, thank you. I have already addressed this issue in my previous responses. So basically, I think we need to establish a right balance among the three different thinkings or approaches. In order to do that, I think we need to work together to have North and South Korea's stay away from their existing preferences. North Korea too much of realism, and South Korea too much of utopianism or constructivism. In order to do that, I think we need to distract them to some extent, distract both North and South Korea. And one of the ways that we can think about is international human rights. the latest event, the killing of the South Korean civilian, is clear indication of North Koreans' hostile regime against, human rights, and it's a clear violation of human rights. I can just, can go forever, but most notably, it is a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that North Korea has signed. And considering the fact that the two Koreas are still at, technically at war with each other, we can apply the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war as well. So from this perspective, we should help North and South Korea work toward this direction. But unfortunately, as I said, South Korea is very proactive and is working really hard to be a responsible stakeholder in international society, and it is a very reliable player in terms of rules-based order. But when it comes to North Korea, South Korea becomes very, superficial and shallow. And the clear indication is the North Korean human rights, the resolution by the United Nations. This past June, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning human rights violation by North Korea for the 18th consecutive year since 2003. And unfortunately, South Korea did not join in co-signing the adoption of the resolution. In fact, South Korea has shown very ambivalent position toward this issue in order not to provoke North Korea for, to some extent, understandable reasons. But since the second nuclear test in 2009, the then Lee Myung-bak government decided to join the UN joint effort to warn against North Korea's human rights violations. But then the Moon Jae-in government stopped doing this in 2018. So 2019 and 2020, this is a 2 consecutive years that South Korean government did not participate in the adoption of the resolution. So then what can you do? I think the South Korean government should participate. I mean, it was a part of the responses to the Inter-Korea Summit in 2018, and apparently South Korea did not want to provoke North Korea in this regard, but that indicates that this is one of the North Korea's weakest link. Why not? Of course, it takes time to change the direction of North Korea's realist approach. It will take some time for us to change our direction, but if you just focus on the institutional approach, yes, it may take longer, but we can make some changes in that regard. So it's time not only for North Korea, but South Korea, but also the international community to focus again on the North Korean human rights issues and approach the inter-Korea relations from an institutional perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Jeon.
Yes, let me focus on this, how we could proceed with the denuclearization and the peace settlement on the Korean Peninsula to utmost policy goals, not only for Koreans and for regional and for the US. And I think for the continuously, we are facing with several options how to deal with the DPRK nuclear problem. And when 2017, DPRK had numerous nuclear tests and ICBM tests, and we have to choose options. And now, again, it's the same way. In my view, there are 4 groups of policy options we could think of as this diagram shows. And this A shows that we are having nuclear crisis somewhere in between. You know, DPRK is in between, and our North Korea policy is either in between. And in this case, you know, DPRK, we know DPRK is going to move toward more of increasing their nuclear capabilities. Then our options could be either, you know, B is more like we are having much stronger, you know, military buildup, so that we could deter DPRK's threat. So it's like, you know, trend is moving toward against each other. So that is the kind of options that we have to do somehow. There is a lot of people are saying that you know, DPRK is keep developing weapons. So we have to strengthen our alliance, U.S.-Korea alliance. We have to bring in more, you know, weapons, and there should be much stronger U.S.-Korea military exercises. But it may bring in some balance of terror. But on the other hand, it's going to increase war crisis and intensify nuclear crisis. That's problematic. And some people say that we may have to learn to live with nuclear DPRK, as this scenario E shows. You know, a lot of people say that each DPRK is going to keep nuclear weapons for a long, long time. We don't have much choice, but it's also unacceptable for us. If DPRK have nuclear weapons, probably South Korea needs to have nuclear weapons too. But if we are going to have nuclear weapons, we may have to live with like North Korea. We cannot export, we cannot import, just like North Korea. So D is not an option, not a good option to us. And also, the people a lot talk about, you know, we need to force denuclearization somehow, politically and militarily. How does it? For decades, we have raised the issue of surgical strike DPRK nuclear facilities. We need to have a you know, DPRK regime collapse approach. And Koreans, Americans, all times when we have, especially US and Korea has a conservative government, we tend to emphasize this forced denuclearization. But even in 1990s, when DPRK was a very early stage of nuclear development, we could not execute these options because it was too dangerous. Now, when DPRK has at least more than a dozen nuclear weapons, certainly it's going to be more dangerous. Then in Korea, our progressive government, when they come to power, they always tend to emphasize this peace regime building approach. Here I saw as a C. It shows that, you know, DPRK is not going to give up the weapon easily. So we need to make a parallel progress of denuclearization and the peace regime building. Only in that case, we could make a serious progress. I somehow believe that the current Moon-Jae-in government have this C option as their plan A, and also US agreed somehow in that way too. So I believe that C is probably a more realistic option to us because other options are either acceptable or too dangerous. The next slide, please. Here, I just want to emphasize this number 2. And I think we need to return to the very basics of why countries are going nuclear and when they are supposed to be giving up the weapons. Many scholars come to a certain conclusion. One of these scholars was Scott Sagan from Stanford. He said that the countries are going for the reasons of security, politics, prestige, and the leadership purposes. So when these problems are somehow eased or solved, they tend to give up. So when we really want to denuclearize DPRK, denuclearize DPRK, we need to take care of DPRK, the security problem, politics problem, prestige problem, leadership problem. Otherwise, it's going to be just a repetition of all previous failed denuclearization diplomacy. It's going to be very difficult for us to do it, but I think that when we are going to pursue this plan A of a peace regime building to be complemented by this building up our deterrence capability as a plan B or C, probably we may have a much better chance of moving toward the denuclearization. So as this number 3 shows, we need to choose and execute a realistic option for longer period of time. In the meantime, in the US, both US and Korea, we have changed government from conservative and progressive. When we are changing our policies, North Korea policies, either maximum sanctions or maximum engagement, it's not going to work out. So we need to have a more sustainable North Korea policies with the realistic options. Then probably we may have a much better chance of moving toward the peace settlement and the denuclearization as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jeon. And thank you for both speakers for not only your participation on this really interesting and fascinating event, but also for keeping your comments within the allotted time so that we have time for questions. I could see that questions are already queuing up. They're being sent to me, and I apologize if we're not able to get to all of the questions because we do have limited time, but let me just dive right into them. The first correct question is for Professor Jeon. What is your opinion on how to introduce capitalistic market, the capitalistic market to the DPRK compared to China and other communist countries? Is this a desirable option?
Let me answer now.
Yes, please.
Do I answer now?
Yes.
Yeah. Certainly, we need to bring in more market. It has been our North Korea policy for a long time. Certainly, but DPRK, they've tried several times to bring in some market elements, but when they saw side effects, they just turned away. So, of course, it's very desirable for DPRK to bring in and expand their market, but it's also, DPRK is also, they are controlling politically. So, my suggestion is that I believe it's good to have them to have a market, and we need to induce them to have more markets. Then DPRK might be more susceptible to foreign, international influence. That's good.
Okay, the second question is, I guess, let me just direct this to Professor Koo. Do you think the current Moon government has too much of a one-sided expectation by major parties' preference? North Korea doesn't seem to be ready or open to reunite with South Korea. I guess the question is general to comment about the current administration's policy.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both. As you know, the ruling party currently enjoys a super majority. So it can just, do anything as it wants. In the meantime, the opposition party is in a very, how do you say, poor stage. It is not organized at all. It doesn't really show any alternative visions for the South Korean voters. So I think that's not healthy. That's not good. So we need a balance of power, but unfortunately, the balance of power is sort of breaking down, and then that partly explains why the Moon-jae-in government is leaning toward excessively the very conciliatory or appeasement policy to the North. So we need that balance get back to normal sooner rather than later.
So I wonder if I could ask a version of that question to Professor Jeon. In your comments, you talk about the desirability of a longer sustained kind of plan or a longer sustained policy from South Korea towards North Korea. And that's obviously very challenging because, there's a new president every 5 years and a new administration every 5 years. How should or could South Korea develop some more consistency, given that, with every new administration, there are different priorities and different strategies, whereas, North Korea obviously doesn't have that problem, right? It's always the same person, well, within, somebody dies or something, but within, longer periods of consistent leadership. So how do you deal with that problem?
That's one of the big challenge that we have. We discussed that a lot inside our, Korea, South Korea, but still we couldn't figure out. The problem was that when I saw other cases, most of the small and medium-sized policies, there was some domestic political consensus how to manage foreign policy issues. There is a very consistent foreign policy, but in South Korea somehow, as this geopolitical situation shows, our domestic opinions are so divided about North Korea policies, U.S. policies, U.S.-China relations. That's our big challenge. But still, I believe that we need to have more dialogue among us, among our especially policy community. When we have some policy community, consensus, we may persuade our politicians to be to listening to us and to have a more sustainability.
Okay, thank you. The next question begins with a comment. This questioner asks, I have long felt that the singular focus on full denuclearization was not likely to be effective. Instead, I feel that the economic and social integration with South Korea, the US, and other countries would provide the best likelihood of avoiding the potential risk of North Korea becoming a nuclear power. Given North Korea's geopolitical position, it does not seem logical to me that they would give up their nuclear pursuit for protection or leverage. I would appreciate hearing your comments in this regard. So maybe we could ask both presenters to answer this question. Maybe begin with Professor Koo.
Yeah, just, let me give you a very short answer. As long as the top priority of North Korea lies in its own security or existence, as rightly pointed out by the audience, they're not going to give up on their nuclear weapons. But if their priority somehow becomes it's a prosperity, then North Korea will find it's uncomfortable with maintaining its nuclear weapons. So we need to help North Korea to move up on the ladder. Otherwise, we will just get stuck to this very realistic vision, version of the world. So, for instance, South Korea itself has been tempted to have develop nuclear weapons, but there is no consensus. I mean, not many people agree with this option because it will affect our prosperity, not security, but prosperity. So we don't want to go there. But North Korea, remember that it's in the stage of survival or death. So given this situation, I think it is very unlikely that North Korea will give up their nuclear weapons.
Professor Jeon?
Yes, I agree with this opinion that our single focus on denuclearization would I believe that hardening DPRK position. So we need to have some multifaceted approach. We need to work on every level with the DPRK and inter-Korean economic, societal, cultural, political, and also regional approaches. So this kind of a multiple approach is going to soften the DPRK position, and we may have a much better chance.
Okay, thank you. This next question is for Professor Koo, and I'm sensing a little bit of skepticism in this question. So do you believe signing another resolution without any actions will lead to peace or unification? What practical actions can be taken towards peace?
Yes, that's a very legitimate concern. And for the record, I'm not that naive to believe that another UN resolution will resolve or settle the North Korean human rights crisis. But it can be one of the few tools, policy tools that we can rely on. For instance, by avoiding the participating in the UN resolution, South Korea has voluntarily deprived itself of very important leverage against North Korea. And no wonder that North Korea currently sees South Korea as a non-factor. I mean, they have nothing to expect from South Korea. We just, drop that policy option on our own. So I think that's very unfortunate. And let me put it this way. Yes, it will take a very longer time period, but liberal approach or institutional approach can be one of the maximum legal pressure on North Korea, as well as its critical ally, China. So human rights issues, China has, as you know, many problems. And then considering the fact that during the Trump administration, China-North Korea relations have deepened and widened. The human rights issues can be the weakest link between the Sino-North Korean relations. So that's why I believe that international community should work harder and to be more focused on this issue.
Thank you. And then the last question that we have time for is, how do you expect the results of the US 2020 elections to affect Korean policy vis-a-vis North Korea? Or what will be the effect you think of the possible outcomes of the election on the situation?
Let me say a word about this. President Trump was a very unusual president, so he could break the U.S. Diplomatic practice of not directly talking to rogue states, the head of rogue states. In that case, he could be praised that he opened dialogue with Kim Jong-un, but somehow he was lacking a real strategy for the denuclearization. That was problematic. But I believe that when Joe Biden becomes a president, I think they have a denuclearization I think a dialogue, a policy, and a denuclearization strategy. But if I look at the DPRK, a traditional approach, they're using more of a bureaucratic approach. In that case, it's going to take a much longer time. So it could have a much delayed dialogue. It could may not produce results. So I hope that I hope that they could combine a political approach by the Trump with a more of an engagement policy and with a strategically oriented approach by Joe Biden.
And Professor Koo?
I'm on basically the same page, but unfortunately, even if Joe Biden wins the presidential election, there might not be much differences. Of course, it will become less dramatic as compared to what President Trump has done to North Korea. But I don't think the President Joe Biden will be able to settle or resolve this North Korean dilemma during his 4-year term or 8-year terms. So we need to be prepared for a longer process of settlement and resolution of the North Korean nuclear issues.
Dr. Koo, Dr. Jeon, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a fascinating hour. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I apologize to those who asked questions that we couldn't get to. I believe Victoria Jones, are you there? You wanted to say a few words in closing?
Yes, just thanks, absolute thanks. This has been so illuminating, and I think that for many of us in the US, it was when President Trump began, as you said, a rather unorthodox, unusual approach to the issue between North and South Korea that it became important to many of us to understand. And you have helped us to see why it is so complex, why the solution will be long in coming, but why there is still hope. And I want to thank you, Dr. Koo and Dr. Jeon, for joining us from South Korea, and Dr. Jeon, our UCI professor, director of Center for Critical Korean Studies. Thank you all very much for sharing your insights with us, and we wish for the best in both of our countries and situations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for our audience for attending as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you.